Welcome to Criminal Record, the Daily Record's new weekly crime show. My name is Norman Silvester, and I'm crime reporter with the Daily Record. Today we continue our examination of the long-running Lyons and Daniel gangland feud. We take a look at an announcement at the weekend by First Minister John Swinney for a crackdown on youth violence, and we'll also examine the shocking new Scottish Government figures which show yet another increase in our drugs death toll. Today in the studio to discuss these and other issues, we have the former Director General of the Scottish Crime and Drugs Enforcement Agency, Graeme Pearson. Welcome, Graeme.
Good morning.
When you were head of the Scottish Crime and Drugs Enforcement Agency, were you aware of the Lyons and Daniels families as an emerging, feuding, organised crime group? And could more have been done at the time, perhaps to nip this in the bud?
Certainly the families were known to the police. The long-standing involvement in crime in the north side of the city. The Daniels family initially were engaged with second-hand cars, wrecked cars, and scrap metal type crime. And the Lyons were fairly petty when it came to their involvement in criminality. The acceleration in the way they moved up through the echelons of criminality were fairly rapid and reflected Scotland's experience with drugs and through drugs into wider criminality of fraud and all that we now experience in our communities.
What's the biggest change you've seen in the way organised crime groups operate, particularly in the drugs market? The murders last month of Eddie Lyons Jr. and Ross Monaghan now in the Costa del Sol now suggest a growing international dimension. Can you explain about how the drugs trade's changed in that way over the years?
It has changed very dramatically over the years. Over 30 years, it's changed in an evolution, but the last 10 years has changed quite dramatically. From being a local type involvement in drugs, when I was a young detective officer, cannabis was known around the west of Scotland, but reasonably rare. LSD in the 70s became popular, but again, it was unusual to locate any collection of drugs of LSD. Heroin was almost unknown. And I remember at one time, the Detective Chief Inspector in the drug squad, Mr. Beattie, would often say that he knew each of the addicts in Glasgow personally. Mm-hmm. So few were they in terms of police involvement. That changed in the 80s. And heroin delivered largely from Liverpool and London became a regular occurrence, and communities which previously had been challenged and difficult to police and could be criminal in many aspects collapsed. And men particularly that one knew at one stage to be folk who had to be thought about fairly clearly became shambles. As they wandered about some parts of the city. And indeed, I later found in many of the small towns around the west of Scotland and then elsewhere in Scotland. So nowadays, what our Scottish criminals have learned is that the best thing to do is bypass Liverpool, bypass London, and go direct to Europe. So via Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Antwerp, various cities in Portugal and Spain, they now access supplies of drugs, heroin, cocaine, more regularly direct from suppliers, and therefore they get a better price. And those drugs are not cut to the extent they used to be in the 70s and 80s. So it's a purer drug that's being fed, and as a result, it's cut with all sorts of rubbish, in all truth, here in Scotland.
We know that a lot of the major criminals now, organised crime groups from Scotland, now able to deal direct with the cartels in South America. Colombia and Mexico. That's been a development in recent years as well, hasn't it?
It has. Quite naturally, during the late 21st century, the cartels discovered that the way the Americans were dealing with cartels and with their wealth became very inconvenient, because the American law enforcement were actually capturing cartel bosses and taking them to America and giving them huge sentences, and at the same time seizing their wealth. So South America, Colombia, Mexico, the cartel owners there decided they should get another market. And of course, Europe was sitting there on the map. They'd had little involvement with Europe previously, but they discovered there was a wealth of options there. The nation states had very little in the way of barriers to travel, and there was a desire for drugs at that time, and it became very popular to access, particularly cocaine, which came from Colombia and Mexico direct.
Direct from there. The international dimension's been reflected in this current ongoing feud with the emergence of Dubai and United Arab Emirates as a hub for organised crime groups like the Lyons and Daniels and others, where they seem to, with little done by the local authorities, they seem to be able to set up residence there, whether it's hotels or flats, and sort of plan their criminal empires.
Yeah.
What would you like to see done in this respect? Why do the Emiratis authorities appear so relaxed about the presence of organised crime groups from the UK and from Scotland?
Yeah, there is a bit of a quandary there about how this has come about. Bear in mind that at one stage, our homegrown criminality moved to mainland Europe, and they found that places like Amsterdam were good locations to operate out of, and some of the areas in Spain, southern Spain. The authorities took some years to catch up with that, and eventually they realised that our Scottish links were not wholesome and were causing problems for them locally, and they finally took steps to deal with them. So as a result, criminals looked for new pastures and discovered that Dubai was there waiting for them. And I would expect that the authorities in Dubai will catch up with that reality now, particularly with the current ongoing nature of crime in Scotland and how it's impacting here. And those who are based in the Emirates will find life continually to become disrupted, uncomfortable, and one would hope that the UK government will come with a treaty in order that we can extradite people from Dubai back here to UK where warrants exist. I think there's already scenes of that occurring in Ireland, and I would hope you would follow that example.
What can be done by the police in Scotland to curb organised crime group activities at a more local level? What would you like to see done? We know that the police have had a lot of success in recent years in bringing senior members of the various crime gangs to prison, often with quite lengthy sentences. Is enough being done? Can more be done?
More can always be done. In my time, I was very frustrated by the fact that we had limited opportunities to bring these organised crime groups to account, and we always tried to push the barriers as best I could during my time. And indeed, I then went on to the Parliament and tried to encourage those in government to listen at that stage. There are things that we can do, certainly with the proceeds of crime legislation. I spent a lot of time promoting that legislation in the early 2000s, but I was told that what I was looking for was too draconian. Well, I think the last 20 years has shown what happens when one is relaxed about how you administer the seizure of assets from organised crime. We don't seize enough, and we don't withdraw the wealth that comes from the criminality. And that's the key to organised crime. If you reduce the profit and you seize the profit, then what's the point of all this effort that they go to? They may well find other things to do, but you begin to snub organised crime on a month-by-month basis.
Would you like, we all know that for a crime gang, organised crime group to be successful, they must be able to launder the money. We know the various means have done it over the years. You think there needs to be tougher proceeds of crime legislation? It had to be, maybe in your own words, has to be more draconian.
Oh, I've no doubt. I mean, I think that the existence of organised crime in our communities is like cancer. It's killing communities, literally killing communities. And it's also holding businesses back who can't perform to the best extent because they are, to some extent, intimidated by organised crime, who have cash available and they have people available who can do that intimidation for them. So we do need to look at the proceeds of crime legislation as a matter of urgency. I've asked for this for 15 years now. Let's hope that the current experience is such that those who can introduce such legislation will now move and ensure that the money that has been taken from communities is returned back to those communities where it belongs.
Would you believe that where we identify an individual who has, criminal assets, all the assets must be surrendered? It's not a question of, well, some are clean and it has to be absolutely zero tolerance?
Well, I take a very ordinary view of these things. Mm-hmm. If one has muddy water and you mix it with clear water, it's impossible to then find where the clean water is. It's gone. I think that where organised crime funds are mixed with legitimate funds, then everything should go. It shouldn't be for forensic accountants to spend years trying to divide out what they can and cannot prove, where it's indicated that a business owner, for instance, agrees to accept funding from organised crime for the purposes of money laundering, then that whole business is tainted.
We have seen, as we discussed earlier, quite a lot of successes by Police Scotland targeting associates of the Lyons and Daniel crime families at quite a senior level.
Yeah. We
know that some of those members are doing life sentences. We see the courts imposing quite significant tariffs. We know of two Daniel associates who were convicted of a murder, received a 30-year tariff. They must serve that before they can be released. But this doesn't seem to be discouraging the tit-for-tat violence that we constantly see. We've seen all sorts of fire bombings and other attacks in the past 3 months in Edinburgh and Glasgow. We've seen more than 42 arrests by Police Scotland. Yet the fire bombings and attacks continue. Why is that? Why doesn't the hefty penalties in police action appear to be a deterrent?
Well, the element that lies behind all of this is the wealth pie that's created by drugs, people smuggling and the rest of it. So where you're talking about hundreds of millions of pounds to be fought over, there will always be somebody willing to accept money to go and commit these acts. And there will always be people who are willing to try and lead these cartels because the lifestyle that comes along with that wealth is something they could never have had before in their previous lives. So folk are coming from often very working class backgrounds, are suddenly finding themselves able to access high value cars, high value homes and travel the world. They want to hold on to that. And they will pay people to try and protect them to that extent.
Well, is it the case that for a young person that the criminal life, despite all the risks, and they'll maybe see their associates being arrested and spending quite considerable time in prison, but that's not deterrent. Are the rewards so great? The lifestyle, it's a lifestyle, isn't it? The holidays in Dubai, for example.
It's the ambition of the lifestyle, because very often the lifestyle isn't quite as glorious as one imagines, because eventually they become paranoid with the view that they're next. Either some criminal will shoot them or attack them, or the police will come and arrest them. And that's a 7-day-a-week concern for those who are engaged in it. But the ambition that these young people have in believing it's a wonderful way forward, and the absence of any alternatives being offered in Scottish society leaves a lot of young people open to the attraction from organised crime. So we've got to find a way of making education more relevant, jobs to be created thereafter, so young people know that when they're at school, it's going to take them somewhere that they think has got a future and ambition. everybody wants to feel valuable and wants to feel they've got a future in life. And that's what we need to do for young people, to direct them away from organised crime. And we need to make sure that organised crime don't profit from the work that they do.
Does the Scottish Government need to do more? And what about professional bodies like lawyers and accountants, whose members might be facilitating this criminality? Because presumably, if you're running a host of businesses laundering money, you need somebody to do the laundering, or you need somebody to facilitate that. Yeah.
Well, certainly when the legislation first came into being, I went round the country speaking to lawyers all around Scotland and the Law Society, and indicated to them the threat that offers to lawyers. There's precious few lawyers have been subject of prosecution since then, and yet organised crime has blossomed, particularly in the last 10, 15 years. So there's something missing there in terms of the way the legislation is taken forward. But that also, that approach not only should pertain to lawyers, but also to accountants and to other professionals who become engaged in the work on behalf of organised crime. There's no doubt that once one is approached by someone within organised crime to do work for them, that approach will be unusual and rarely will go through the books in a normal manner. So that should be the red flag that says to people in legitimate society, this is something I don't want to be involved in, and also something that should be reported.
There also needs to be more penalties, presumably, for professional bodies or members,
certainly,
lawyers, accountants, or whoever,
certainly,
breach that.
Definitely.
Just, we covered this earlier, but a lot of people might say, well, it's guys involved in organised crime, that doesn't really involve us. But what are the implications for society, for Scotland, if the organised crime groups take control? And we've seen a bit about we see in other countries the whole political influence, obviously the effect on the economies as well. They're able to, I suppose, provide services at a cheaper price, and that impacts the sort of legitimate businesses. What are the implications for our society and law and order generally if we allow the organised crime groups we've discussed earlier to thrive?
Yeah. Well, I think that the problem with the view that says let them get on with it is that the people who replace those who are murdered or fall by the wayside won't be any better at the way they conduct their lives. If not, they will become more and more violent as each year passes to protect the wealth that they see as theirs. And equally, that element of corruption that comes with them. Organised crime corrupts everything that they do business with. That includes police officers, prison officers, folk in offices that do administration for public service. We need to take steps to protect our way of life and to ensure that people who want to work hard in our society are able to do so unfettered and without fear of what organised crime may do to their lifestyle.
The First Minister, John Swinney, has announced a youth violence summit aimed at reducing crime amongst the young. That's following two knife-related deaths of two teenagers, one last month in Irvine Beach in Ayrshire for a 16-year-old, a death of a 16-year-old, and a death in March in Glasgow of a 15-year-old. What would you like to see come out of this summit, this gathering? And could such a summit be used to target young people who might in future become involved in organised crime? Might that be a way of a kind of intervention to stop the Lyons and Daniel crime families of the future? Yeah.
Well, I think the first thing that we need to be sure of is that young people aren't lectured about criminality. Young people know what's going on in their streets, particularly in some of these communities that are on the edge. They live with it every day and they can see it with their own eyes. So they don't need a politician or some professional person to come and lecture them about it. What they do need is what I'd said earlier. They need to have a lifestyle that they can follow through that's meaningful to them. They need to know that education will offer them something that's valuable going forward in their lives. They need to know there are jobs. The number of people I've spoken to in the last few years who are desperate for apprentices, but find it very difficult to identify young people who come forward and work with them. There's a problem there. And we talk so often about AI, the computer age and so forth. What does that mean to a young person who's living in a household where there's no one in employment? So we need to find a way, and John Swinney, as First Minister, needs to find a way of actually saying something to that young community that's meaningful to them, rather than just a headline in the newspaper and we move on. And that seems to be what government has done over this last 20 years.
But there's something that could be used to target young people who might be lured into a life of organised crime.
Certainly.
Offering them alternatives, looking at how we can divert them away from the lure of being a member of a gang, the Lyons and Daniel gang, or whatever we call the gang.
Certainly. And that thing is meaningful. That means something to them. It's designed to be attractive for them. So if we talk about youth clubs, for instance, we need to invest in that youth club. It's not enough just to give them an empty room with a couple of plastic chairs in it, and that becomes a centre, as well-meaning as that might be. Young people are increasingly sophisticated in their knowledge of what goes on in society. Give them challenges in these centres and take them into experiences that they will remember for the rest of their days.
And show them better opportunities in
exactly so.
Finally, new figures from the Scottish Government show suspected drug deaths have risen by a third in the first 3 months of this year, back to 308, and they're up by 76 in the last 3 months of 2024. Again, it's Scotland's shame in many respects,
yes,
the highest drugs death rate in Europe. But we could tie this all into this whole organised crime group problems that we have, the influence of organised crime groups, the violence that we're seeing. Is there a connection there?
I mean, there's two elements to this. One is we've got a growing demand for drugs, which is generated and encouraged by criminals. They want to have as many customers out there as is possible to generate. Over the decades, government have talked repeatedly about the interventions they will bring to pass that will improve things and put us in a better state. We'll go back, as I left the service, trying to say we need different solutions. I was told we've got the solutions and over the coming years we will see the improvement. That's never occurred. We've gone from bad to worse over the last 20 years. And part of that is we've been sold in headlines. We'll have a needle exchange. That will improve things for needles and we'll be able to speak to addicts and get them on board for recovery. We've still got the problem with needles lying in public places and communities complaining bitterly about the impact. They introduced methadone and said methadone is the way forward. That will stabilise those who are abusing drugs and again give us the opportunity for intervention and reduce the numbers involved. More than 25% of our prisoners queuing up every morning in prisons for methadone. And it's spread right across the community and our drugs deaths still continue to rise against these backgrounds. So we need new means of intervention, new means of treatment and encouragement towards treatment, and at the same time invest in enforcement that reduces the numbers of drugs coming into the country to be abused. You need both sides of that, not just one side.
Just before we leave that subject, a lot of the organised crime groups, Lyons and Daniel family crime groups, we've discussed operating housing estates, housing schemes. What can police do at a local level? Should there be more, enforcement on the streets, maybe at a lower level, disrupting them, stop and search, whatever term you might want to use?
I'm a firm believer that it begins with good local beat officers aware of their communities and knowing what goes on there that begins the interruption of criminality. So the inconvenience of driving licenses, insurance, MOTs, tyres that are fit for purpose, domestic abuse, involvement in street dealing in these communities, that gives communities the hope that it can be improved by involving the police and other services in that community.
Would you like to see more resources for that kind of, we used to call it beat policing or community policing, where we're targeting the major figures as they drive about, as they go about their normal ordinary business?
Yes. I mean, life is too easy for those involved in organised crime if they're not being interrupted by regular officers who take an interest in their business. And we need to encourage that side going forward. And, mentioning in the passing, with 1,000 fewer officers currently engaged in policing in Scotland now than was 5 years ago, that's not a healthy way forward.
And if we got these numbers up, they could be diverted into these communities where the organised crime groups are active.
Well, I would. The one bit I would take out your sentence there is, rather than could be, should be. Mm-hmm. Too much is about back office stuff, about bureaucracy and administration. What public need are police officers on the street and police officers to speak to as they go about their daily business. And we need officers who are interested in doing that work, backed up by good support staff who gather the intelligence and information that's necessary to undermine the effort of organised crime.
And it's that type of traditional policing that could be effective in bringing the various organised, reducing the power and influence of these organised crime groups?
Well, it might be seen as traditional, but it's realistic and it works.
Thank you, Graeme, for joining us, and thanks to our audience for tuning in to Criminal Record. If you have a question for the team, you can email reporters@dailyrecord.co.uk with the subject line Criminal Record. You can subscribe to listen to this podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts by searching for Criminal Record, or you can watch it each week on our YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us.